Welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast. My name's Anthony Oliver, and the discussion today is going to be interesting. In fact, I suggest that you buckle up as we take a freewheeling dive into the world of behavioural science to find out how a focus on human psychology might radically transform our infrastructure and transportation planning. My guest today is globally renowned behavioural scientist and leading disruptive thinker Rory Sutherland, who frankly blew my mind when I heard him speak at the Interchange conference earlier this year. There he effectively put a rocket under the current transport planning system and urged a radical rethink towards what he described as a more human-centred approach, ensuring that travel is more than just a means of getting from A to B and actually enhances our lives along the way. Rory's vice chairman of advertising giant Ogilvy UK, and in his latest book, Transport for Humans, which I highly recommend every person in transport and infrastructure should read, he points out that the way engineers design and measure the success of transport solutions is, in short, just plain wrong. The current focus on speed, journey times and efficiency, he reckons, are aimed at Homo transporticus, an idealised, naturally selected transport user who possesses an encyclopedic knowledge of our transport networks and ticketing systems, yet real human beings are very different. We actually value more. We value experiences based on more emotionally driven measures, such as comfort, being in control, or even just having a fold-down tray table on our train seat. So, designers need to bin the current siloed thinking and avoid what he describes as the quantification trap of cost-benefit analysis to embrace a human-centric approach that rethinks our notion that the only way to increase capacity is to build more. So let's find out a bit more. Rory, welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast.
It's a pleasure. I should point out that the book is co-authored, and to be honest, he did perhaps the greater part of the work, I think, by Pete Dyson, who has been variously the head of behavioural science at the Department for Transport. But he was a wonderful co-author. Yeah.
We'll give Pete all the credit he's due. Anyway, let's get into this and start with this quantification trap that leads to transport systems being designed for Homo transporticus. What is it? What is Homo transporticus, and why is it such a problem for infrastructure professionals and transport planners?
First of all, I'm going to make an unusually woke comment for me, which is I think the people involved in the design and conception of transport were disproportionately male.
Right.
And disproportionately keen on what you might call engineering problems rather than psychological problems or problems of empathy and human understanding. And they have that kind of mentality which absolutely loves neatness and certainty. And of course, once you stray into psychological questions, the downside is you get a greater degree of ambiguity, but the upside is you have a much larger solution set. And in many cases, a much cheaper solution set. So let me give you two perfect comparisons, okay? One of them is an engineering triumph. It cost £20 billion, and it's called Crossrail, or now the Elizabeth Line. And it's a very, very good thing. I don't dispute that. I think penetrating lines of transport like Thameslink are actually rather important because
I used both of them yesterday, Rory.
Exactly. And there's a fundamental problem with hub and spoke, which is it concentrates people in one place. If you're a dual wage earning family, you can't really move out to Surrey because unless both of you work reasonably close to, say, Victoria, okay, right, you may have a problem. On the other hand, you could move out to Berkshire on the grounds that, if both of you work reasonably close to the Elizabeth Line, you now have a tolerable commute for both of you. Okay. So, I'm not denigrating engineering, not for a second. However, let's look at a parallel success, which is a marketing and psychological success. Okay. Which doesn't improve the physical availability of transport, but does improve the mental availability of transport. And that's the Overground, which I recently submitted as one of the 10 greatest advertising campaigns of all time, even though it wasn't an advertising campaign. But it was an inspired piece of branding and psychology, which is this, okay? Most of those lines, 95% of the track, already existed 30 years ago. All right. It was called variously things like the North London Line or Silverlink Metro. OK.
Yeah.
And literally no one knew it existed. I had some friends who lived near Clapham South, which was only 100 yards further away from Clapham High Street Station. And I asked them both, I said, that Clapham High Street Station, where do the trains go? One of them didn't know. The other one didn't even know there was a station there. Okay. Right. Now, they did do some physical things. I'm not suggesting it was purely a marketing success. They upgraded the rolling stock. I think they increased the frequency. They built a few extra miles of track to connect, previously unconnected little parts of the line. But most important of all, they gave it a name and an identity, and they added it to the tube map.
Yeah.
Londoners, particularly North Londoners, are absolutely useless at navigating London except by aid of the tube map. Okay, because they think the tube map is representative of London, whereas, as we all know, the map is not the territory. Now, by adding the overground to the tube map, you made the whole thing absolutely mentally accessible, and suddenly people saw how it fitted into their transport repertoire. Now, here's the really interesting thing. It probably cost, I'm guessing what they did physically, probably cost £100 million or so, maybe a bit more. The rest was done with ink and pixels and information and branding and psychology. Okay. The overground in a day carries as many people as the Elizabeth line does, and the Elizabeth line cost £20 billion. So if you think that actually psychological solutions aren't valuable, I think you've got that to contend with.
Yeah. But you also make a very interesting point in the book about the need to travel with comfort and dignity and occasional joy.
And comprehension's the table stakes. I mean, most behavioural change is you know this from the COM-B model. Capability, opportunity, motivation to lead to the B, which is the behaviour. Okay, so actually comprehension's the first part. I love buses, but some designer decided that the only information you put on a bus is the number and its final destination, okay? Which, unless you're an absolutely tragic bus nerd, okay, I want to know, does this bus go to a station from which I can get home, okay? So I'm a fairly typical Sevenoaks resident, okay? I can go home from London Bridge, Victoria, St Pancras, anywhere on the Thameslink network. I can get home from there. I can get home from Cannon Street, okay? If it goes to one of those stations, I'm tickety-boo. But I don't know, because all I'm told is that the final destination is effing Clapton Ponds. I don't know where, I've lived in and around London for 30 years. I don't know where Clapton Ponds is, and I'd only go there if I needed to dispose of a corpse, okay? So if they just said via on the front of a bus, I would use buses literally 5 times more often.
But of course, going back to the point you make around overground, of course, one of the things that's revolutionised the use of buses, particularly in London, is the ability to have the time it's going to arrive on your phone. That's a sharing of data. So that's a low-cost way of thinking about it. And
even better would be to put it on the bus stop.
Right.
But the reason they don't do that, apparently, I spoke to someone at TfL, that if you spend any money on something which doesn't materially budge one of their objective metrics, like capacity, speed, and punctuality, it's very hard to get funding.
Right.
Now, being fair, I don't think a commercial organisation would be that dumb. They'd be asking, how do we get more people to use the buses? You know, there are a hell of a lot of buses where additional bus use is effectively pure profit because the bus is running anyway and it isn't full. But their models are so kind of anally retentive that it's a systems model, not a human behaviour model.
I mean, one of the problems, though, is it's really hard to measure that human-centric, that the psychological issues. And I think you have a suggestion for an SI unit of regret. I think you mentioned that, which is the best, the gigabest. I think measuring that increase in irritation when you miss a train by 1 minute compared to missing it by 20 minutes.
It's we don't have metric. Now, this is the thing. In order to win an argument in a very kind of bureaucratized system, you have to have data. And I've got nothing against data at all, okay? The problem is that when you aggregate data, you lose information. And in many cases, you end up with an average, which is actually meaningless. Because what you're interested in changing behavior is really the outliers.
Yeah.
Okay, it's the exceptions, it's the anecdotal information. But the need to aggregate information to justify your existence and to create these metrics forces you to use numerical metrics, which then leads to quantification bias. Profit isn't a bad metric because it does have a behavioral component. These proxy metrics are highly dangerous because we don't have SI units for regret, delight, surprise. And my idea of an SI unit of regret was the best, which is based on Pete Best, and it's how much regret you feel having nearly been in the Beatles but not quite making it. And therefore, if you narrowly miss a train, that might be a Pico Best, as a unit of regret. Okay. But the problem is we don't have these units. And one of the forms of transport which I think is most underexplored for this reason, I don't know if you've ever travelled on the Heathrow pod.
I haven't actually, no. I've seen them.
Okay. Now, it doesn't score well on any numerical metric, okay? In terms of speed, it's 30 miles an hour. It's relatively cheap to build because you can build it on elevated concrete track. You don't even need any rails. The thing's electric. They recharge themselves. You can build in predictive algorithms so that little pods park where there's likely to be most demand.
Yeah.
What's interesting about the Heathrow pod is that the prices for pod parking are not all that unadjacent to the prices for short stay parking, where you just walk to the check-in desk. Now, the question is, why is that? Where when you have a bus connecting the car park, the long stay car park with every 10, 15 minutes, there's a bus shuttle to Terminal 5. In those cases, the prices are vastly lower. And the only way you can explain this is people really, really like travelling on the pod, and they really dislike travelling on the bus.
Yeah, it's a delight thing.
I have a colleague in his mid-60s, serious kind of, European head of Ogilvy, who used to turn up at the pod parking in his Jag. And they'd say, I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Smith, but our car park's actually full, so we've upgraded you to short stay for no extra charge. Now, his reaction should have been, thank you very much for your generosity. No, it wasn't. His reaction was, as a 60-year-old serious businessman, was, but I wanted to ride on the pod. Okay. Now, actually, the significance of that, forget about speed. It's not about speed. It's not that fast. It is environmentally friendly. It's cheap to build. But the significance of that is that people love pods and hate buses.
I mean, that goes to your phrase, if we make trains better, you don't need to worry about speed. And I've dined out on your notion that employing male and female supermodels to walk up and down trains serving champagne will be a more effective way to actually improve long-distance rail service. And it would be cheaper than building new railway lines. Is that a serious idea, by the way?
The high-speed line was built, okay, about 10 to 15 years before Eurostar put Wi-Fi on the trains. Okay. And that's because they're asking questions about speed on the assumption that time spent in transit is a disutility. That was never true, by the way. People like traveling on certain trains, and they always did, even before you had the range of technological connectivity and entertainment options that you have now. Okay. Now, what was bizarre is they spent $6 billion making the journey to Paris faster. And it was 15 years later, they spent presumably $6 million adding Wi-Fi to the trains, probably less than $6 million. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying you shouldn't have built High Speed 1. I'm just saying that's the wrong way around, because the question you should have been asking is not how do we make this train faster? The question you should have been asking is how do we get people out of the planes and onto the trains? And you can do that with quantity of time, but you'll never beat a plane for pure speed and through the air. You might beat a plane for end-to-end speed. You can certainly beat a plane for end-to-end convenience. Okay, but don't just look at the quantity of time spent on board the train. Look at the quality of that time. Now, here's where High Speed 2 got it wrong. This is what the brief for High Speed 2 should not have been about capacity and speed, primarily. Okay? The first question to ask before you built or planned a single mile of track was simply this: how do we make the journey from London to Manchester or thereabouts so pleasant by train that people feel stupid driving?
Right.
Okay. Now, this is my point, which is that when you reduce quantifiable data and you make things qualitative, not quantitative, you do increase ambiguity. But the upside of that is your solution set's much bigger. Now, another extreme idea for High Speed 2 is you build a line that isn't particularly fast. It stops very frequently, but you put replicas of great steam engines on it. Okay? The Union Pacific big boy, right? Okay. This is an extreme thought experiment. You could have the Union Pacific big boy. You could have the Harry Potter train. Okay. You could have the Mallard. Now, that would mean that every single person who visited London would probably take a trip to Manchester. Right. Okay. Now, all I'm saying is that speed is interesting. It's very difficult beyond a certain point to increase speed because every 10 minutes of time saving requires a geometrically increasing increase in speed, because the faster you go, the less time you have to save time. Gains to speed do not translate in a linear fashion into reductions in journey time. Secondly, as you go faster and faster, the safety, the air resistance, all those laws of physics start acting against you, okay? But gains to quality are potentially infinite.
Yeah.
I mean, all I'm saying is there are no absolutely single quantifiably right answers. And we've developed a generation of people who want to answer exam questions, not solve problems.
Well, this is the next point. Coming to HS2, designing a transport system, say like HS2, through the eye of the passenger. I mean, how do we overcome, what you describe as paradigm blindness, a desire to stick to what that too often affects our transport planners?
Well, first of all, let's be fair about this. So let's give engineers a bit of credit, which is the original Arup plan for HS2, when it was merely a fast train, which I think connected St Pancras, Old Oak Common, Heathrow, then ran up the route of the M40, because if you live next to a motorway, you don't complain that much about a train. Okay, really, really intelligent idea. What it would have cost, we don't know. Would it have had cost overruns? We don't know. But the idea was basically a good one. Bear in mind that the plan predated the COVID and predated the use of Zoom and video conferencing. It was very weird that no one rethought the business case for High Speed 2 after COVID, because patently travel patterns had changed, modes of connectivity had changed, probably irrevocably, But then there's the other question, which is, as I've said, I could increase, if your brief is reduce journey time, increase capacity, I can do that behaviourally, one passenger at a time, for about £1 million. And the solution is this. It's not far off what Seatfrog has subsequently done, okay? You say, first of all, if you book an advance ticket, you're allowed to board the earlier train for a £5, 20 or 40 minutes beforehand, because when I book an advance ticket to Manchester, I have to arrive absurdly early at Euston because if you miss your train, you're financially stuffed because your initial ticket is worthless, which I think is wrong, by the way. Okay. So that's my first complaint. The second thing is, I arrive there 45 minutes before my train leaves, and I spend 45 minutes mooching around Burger King, wondering what to do. And in that time, 2 trains, half empty, leave for Manchester 20 and 40 minutes before my booked train. Why can't I pay to board them if there is available capacity? I've then reduced my journey time by 40 minutes.
Yeah.
But I've also improved the capacity of the network, because where capacity exists, if you want to maximize the capacity of a network, you always want to carry passengers forward. EasyJet used to do a thing, which is if you turned up in one of those places like Malaga, which have tons of EasyJet flights, and you were booked on a flight to Luton at, 2 p.m. and you turned up stupidly early and there was a flight to Gatwick leaving at 12:30, they'd put you on the Gatwick flight if there was capacity, because why not?
Which is what Eurotunnel does.
Eurotunnel, they get you on as soon as you can. Absolutely right.
But that's what you talk about as a human-centric approach to transport. It's about basically asking people, what would make it more attractive to them, rather than just presenting them with a fait accompli and a set of rules. I mean, how do transport planners navigate that? Because you're talking about ticketing here, which if you're designing a railway system, well, that's got nothing to do with me. If you're designing, everybody has their own silos that they get stuck into.
Most business decisions are now taken under a mode of defensive decision-making, which is a posh word for arse covering, okay? And if you've got a mathematical model, okay, you've sort of covered your arse, because it provides you with a single right answer, other than which everything else is wrong. And you don't have to make any trade-offs, and it's an exam question. And you can go, look, I got the right answer, and here's my working out. Now, this is not true of most human-level problems, which don't have... there is no absolutely linear... I'm going to Manchester next Monday, okay? Now, there is no linear relationship between the time of the journey and my propensity to travel to Manchester, okay? I don't get up in the morning, I go to Manchester today, but it takes 10 minutes too long. Furthermore, it's very, very non-linear in many cases. So let's take high-speed rail in France. Okay, TGV, Paris, Lyon. Lyon's kind of the third most important city in France, I guess, although few places might argue with that. Now, previously, before the TGV, it took 4 hours. Now, that's a non-starter for a one-day business trip, for example.
Yeah.
Okay. And even if you're staying overnight, geez, it's 8 hours on a train there and back. Reducing that journey time to 2 hours is a game changer. Okay.
Yeah.
Reducing a Manchester journey from 2 hours to 1 isn't really a game changer. In fact, to be honest, given the hassle at either end, if I'm traveling by train, I almost see the 2 hours on the train as a reward for getting to the station.
Well, it gives you enough time to do the work that you want to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah, if you're going to get your laptop out, you may as well do a bit of decent work.
Now, someone at TfL told me this, that they had some research which showed that people actually enjoyed certain parts of their commute. And one of the people from their modelling team said, you must never, ever say that. He said, well, what do you mean? It's research. It's true, right? He said, no, but you must never say it. Why can't I say this? Because all our travel models rely on travel being seen as a disutility in economic terms. Time spent in transit is a disutility. It is less useful than time spent static. Now, business people fantasize about a 2-hour train journey. You can actually get your shit together, particularly if there's really good Wi-Fi, without people bothering you.
Yeah,
it's an absolute dream, and there's a nice view out of the window.
Yeah. But when you talk about human-centric transport, the vision of having the focus on end-to-end journey times, quality of time spent. I mean, that doesn't necessarily make a project like HS2 unnecessary, though, does it?
No. However, there is a question of should you have built Crossrail until you had experimented with psychological ways of creating greater capacity east to west within London. Now, I'm a big fan of those penetrating railways. I'm a huge Thameslink devotee. Okay. I think the new London Bridge is actually very good in engineering terms, in allowing through traffic of trains. It's a bloody catastrophe in design terms. Saving someone time and effort and hassle and friction, let's say 150 times a year, in an economic model, one person saving, let's say, an hour a day is treated as the same thing as saving 10 people 6 minutes a day. Okay. Now they're not the same. Okay. It's not commutative. Okay. Commuting is not commutative. Now, high speed one is a brilliant idea, by the way. Don't get me wrong. I think high speed one is a game changer. I know East Kent well, and it's a complete game changer, and it's a resounding success now. It wasn't for the first few years because behavioural change takes time, but it is a huge success. And that's because there are a load of people saving time, a significant amount of time, 100 times a year. Reducing journey time for a journey I take 12 times a year is a convenience, but it's not a game changer.
Not a game changer. You are vice chairman of Ogilvy UK. It's a pretty free-flowing role you have there by all accounts. I mean, your background is in advertising. You joined Ogilvy as a graduate trainee in 1988, and then you worked as a copywriter, creative director. I mean, what makes you so interested in transport? Are you really a frustrated transport planner?
It's the perfect place for studying the collision of two tectonic plates between the quantitative reductionist worldview of engineering and the highly qualitative, literally complex system of human behavior and human preference.
Right.
And the reason it's so interesting is, I am a bit of a train nerd. I will kind of, anally consider sort of 4 different journey options.
Are you really Homo transporticus then? Are you?
No, because I have very strong Homo transporticus, by the way, is kind of analogous with the idea of Homo economicus, which is, as in the words of Richard Thaler, it's a creature that is, a rational optimizer with perfect information, perfect trust, which merely seeks to optimize the value of each exchange.
Right, yeah.
And Homo economicus doesn't exist in reality. In fact, in evolutionary terms, it would have been clubbed over the head years ago for being weird. But it exists and populates economic models. And Homo transporticus is the same thing which populates transport models, which is someone who has all the information at their disposal, cares passionately about the speed of the journey, but doesn't care about, for example, the number of changes.
Yeah.
I will go to enormous lengths to drive to Red Hill, take the train to get to Reading, okay, to avoid going into London and out again if I have to go anywhere west.
Yeah.
And that's not because it's faster. It isn't faster. It's slower, but it's a lot less hassle.
Yeah. But as a passionate behavioural scientist, what's the one thing the industry could do today to transform the passenger experience then?
Well, the first thing I do, actually, the death of the season ticket requires a real deep dive into what is called commercial innovation. Now, commercial innovation, part of the reason I don't understand this, right, is if you can create an incremental journey on an off-peak train that isn't full, okay, that is pure profit, okay? So the money that should be available to spend on behavioural change, on encouraging people to make incremental train journeys, should be there, okay? And something to do with the way in which train operating companies have a kind of 7-year kind of franchise. Something is discouraging innovation in that shape or form. So one thing is create things which have a look. I wouldn't copy the Deutsche Bahn card 50, Bahn card 25, Bahn card 100 model necessarily. Although there are some clever features to that, by the way, which is that what happens is that people's employers pay for them. If they travel quite a bit, they pay for them to have a Bahn card 50. And that, as a consequence, they then use the train a lot more for their personal journeys as well as their business journeys.
This is like a prepayment card for...
So I mean, I don't understand why there isn't a retirees rail card that costs £1,000 a year, and on like 5 trains a day, you're allowed to travel for a tenner. I'd also do things which massively incentivize everybody to make... So the other thing I'd do is I'd make the road tax disc £200 more expensive for taxing my car, including electric cars. But in return, you get £240 worth of public transport vouchers.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Yeah.
So the argument is, if you're going to have a car, now you make an exception, people living in the north of Scotland and in rural areas. Okay. But people basically living somewhere where there's an adequate public transport infrastructure. I'm not saying they should abandon their cars and use public transport all the time, but you should at least use public transport enough to make an informed, intelligent decision between traffic modes. So I'd do that.
Is that an idea that's been used somewhere before?
No, there's a similar one. There's a great one in Denmark where I think you get free rail travel on your birthday.
Right.
And the whole intention is, it's quite clever because you don't go on your own. You tend to take some mates with you, okay? But secondly, it just is a way of nudging people to try the train once or twice because there are a lot of things which are like Ocado behaviours. If you can get people to shop from Ocado 4 times, you basically establish yourself as part of their retail repertoire, okay? Getting people to use off-peak rail is a really, really important kind of, but it's hugely profitable and no one's doing anything with it.
Well, that's some ideas of what the industry can do. Give us some tips then as a passenger. How can you be a better passenger?
Now, one of the reasons rail travel surged, okay, was not necessarily caused by what you might call external factors, the desire to travel by train. A large part of the surge in rail travel pre-COVID, I think, came from 2 things. I think it came from yield management pricing, which meant that it was at least worth having a look at the train site in case there was a bargain. Okay, I still don't think those sites are good enough. They should actually let you search for the cheapest ticket across a 2-day window rather than the 2-hour window. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we all know that those bargain tickets, they just don't exist.
Well, they do, but they make it very hard to find them. I mean, there are real bargain tickets. If you're prepared to go at 11 o'clock at night or something, seriously, it's amazing. The second thing is that they automatically assume that speed is the most important thing. So I'll give you a classic example. Let's say I want to get from Sevenoaks to Exeter. Well, the best way to do this is change at Waterloo East. Okay, take the Southwest train service to Exeter, which is slower than going to Paddington. Okay, but it's cheap. It's a lot less of a pain in the arse, and it's also insanely cheaper. And the reason it's insanely cheaper, it's like first class tickets to Exeter from London for sort of 35 quid, is you can't find it on the website. And the reason you can't find it on the website is the website goes, too slow. I'll hide that and make them go to Paddington. Okay. Now, because nobody can find it on the website, there's very little demand, and so the tickets are insanely cheap. What you have to do is you have to go in and you have to go London Waterloo, okay, to Exeter, and then you've got to put in via Salisbury, all right? And then it will finally show you those bloody tickets. Now, not many people put in via Salisbury, right, okay, on their trip. And so this is the kind of thing where we've got to really be careful, because what the algorithm optimizes for okay, is price and time. But actually, there are a load of other factors. A really good algorithm would actually upweight low demand, in other words, low overcrowding journeys to encourage people to diversify their journey.
Which is good for them, and it's good for the rail operator.
Whereas what we're doing is we're concentrating everybody on the same damn thing. Now, that doesn't matter so much with price because it is dynamic. In other words, if everybody buys the cheapest ticket, it won't then be the cheapest ticket. But there are problems there, I think, which is that if everybody chooses in a neat way, actually it creates a very strong winner-takes-all effect.
Well, that brings me on nicely to the last couple of points to finish off with, because, when I heard you speak recently, you talked about this deficit of imagination, and that the use of behavioural science, adding psychological solutions to the engineering solutions, required more creativity and more boldness. Where is it missing?
Of necessity, because it expands the solution set and it gives you trade-offs, okay? Reductionist decision makers don't like it very much because it's not an exam question. It doesn't have a single right answer, okay? How do you make a train so enjoyable? The train journey between Manchester and London is so enjoyable that people feel stupid driving. Okay. Now, actually, there is one great thing which I will praise, which is Avanti have that thing which is kind of standard premium, which is like a business class, first class seat, but without the bling. Okay. But first class, let's talk about first class rail. Okay. If you look at it from a marketing point of view, you ask, how do you get people out of their cars and onto a train? Well, let's be blunt. Okay. Premium economy, or whatever they call it on Avanti, or first class rail, is nicer than driving. Second class rail, standard class rail isn't. So one of the reasons why you've got to have actually this sort of premium offering is if you want to get people to abandon a car, it helps if your service is actually nicer than the car. And I would bluntly say that is true of, if you're a party of four, or a party of four and you can occupy a table, actually standard class is fine. But actually, ultimately having a greater variety of price discrimination on board, I think is a real strength, because that enables people to get out of their car without paying, the full fare, 300 and something pounds it would cost you to go to Manchester if you just had a first class open return.
Yeah. Which brings me to a final point. Your book, Transport for Humans, asserts that transport design has lost its way and has reached this crossroads that require a more imaginative approach to change and find the right path forward. So what's your advice to young transport designers standing at this crossroads right now?
Accept the fact that if you want to solve a problem, a real world human problem won't have the same neat, inarguable solution if it respects behaviour that a purely engineering approach will have, but it will be a better, and as the overground illustrates, in many cases, inordinately cheaper solution to the problem. Now, that may be a disincentive if you work for an engineering firm and you get your rocks off by standing in a field with a theodolite for weeks, okay? But nonetheless, if we're being truly honest about problem solving, we have to consider both locks on the door, the psychological lock and the physical lock. And in many cases, the physical lock may already be open, as was the case with the overground. What you need to do is unlock that thing psychologically.
Okay. Rory, that's a great point. We're going to have to finish there. We're bang out of time. So, there's a huge amount for us all to think about there. Thanks so much for joining me today on the Infrastructure Podcast and helping us to navigate a path through this incredibly difficult area.
It's not difficult. It's fun. Once you open it up, once you open the problem up to psychology and you accept that you have to accept a certain degree of ambiguity and a certain degree of trade-off and a certain degree of subjective decision-making, okay, because you are dealing with future uncertainties. Once you reach that point, it's actually incredibly liberating. There are more right answers, and some of them are really, really cheap. Trust me.
Fantastic. Rory, that's all we've got time for today. Thanks very much. We're going to be more from the Infrastructure Podcast, so more in the pipeline, more guests to talk to as we continue to probe the big issues facing across the sector. If you haven't done so already, do check out the Infrastructure Podcast website, www.infrastructure-podcast.com, where you'll find background links to all the information we talked about today, and also the latest podcast to listen to and to share. So thanks for joining us, Rory.
Absolute joy. Anytime.
I look forward to seeing you all again very, very soon.